Bronwyn Winter lives on Gadigal and Wongal land, but today she is speaking to us from Gerinja land. She is a Professor Emerita of Transnational Studies and a long-time feminist, lesbian and trade union activist in France, Australia, briefly in the UK, and transnationally. Her interdisciplinary academic work has covered various themes, but addressing various forms of violence against women has always been a core preoccupation. Her most recent book is The Political Economy of Same-Sex Marriage, a Feminist Critique. Thank you, panel, and welcome. I'm very thrilled to have you all. We're going to start with Bronwyn. Bronwyn, please, over to you.
I'm assuming everyone knows what ECOSOC's special consultative status is, but I will go into it a little bit because it was a big deal, because COL, as Janet said, was the first lesbian organisation. And unless the Australian Lesbian Medical Association remains accredited, remains the only lesbian organisation in the world, or if ALMA is still accredited, one of the only two, and they're both from Australia, so how about that? Special consultative status means we get to talk to UN diplomats, we get access to UN buildings and conferences, we can attend conferences in areas of our speciality, which is, you know, women, gender, blah, blah, homosexuality, of course. And so that's sort of a big deal. And it sort of a little bit reflects some of the priorities of the co-founder of COL, a woman named Eileen Pittaway, who has worked quite a lot on women refugees and asylum for women fleeing sexual violence, among other things. And Eileen was very, very centrally involved in NGO coordination in the Asia-Pacific region. And so when she co-founded COL, one of the first priorities was to get us on the UN agenda and get us into the UN, and also with the Beijing World Conference coming up in 1995. And as Janet already explained, COL was centrally involved in the NGO space. Unfortunately, myself, I did not get to the conference. I had other things going on at the time, including finishing a PhD, and I had no money. But I was at the COL launch at Clover Business Women's Club in Sydney, which was a sort of middle-class sort of lesbian venue in Sydney, but it was a great place to host parties. So that was where COL was actually launched, and I was there. I was also on the COL committee. Jack and Sand will have to remind me, I know you're here, but they were convening or co-convening or something or other with the COL committee at that time. And I was briefly involved on the committee also at that time, I think as treasurer, a role that I did not cherish, because I think all the bullshit with business activity statements had just come in, and that was a real pain in the ass for NGOs, as many of you will know, because it required endless reporting on what we had less and less time to actually do, because we were too busy reporting on it. It sounds a little bit like working in a university, which has been my experience for a very long time. Anyway, so I didn't make Beijing, but I was at Beijing +5 and Beijing +10. And I'd like to talk a little bit about those, because they reflect a significant shift from what things were like for lesbians in that space then and what they're like for lesbians in that space now. And Viviane will be able to report a little bit more on the now, because she was at the CSW Zoom meeting, I believe, earlier this year or last year, and she can talk about that. But in 2000 and 2005, the main problems lesbians were confronting, because the NGOs with special consultative status, there are thousands of them. It's not like there are 2 or 3, there are lots of them. And unfortunately, religious fundamentalist organisations have that status too. So what we were dealing with in 2000 and 2005 was very strong anti-reproductive rights pushes by some of these groups, and including like harassing women in toilets and backing them up against the wall, and the sort of behaviour we've come to associate with trans-identified males now. But there were some quite vicious women from these groups that were intimidating people. The other big thing they were getting their knickers in a twist about was lesbians. So they'd come into lesbian meetings and try to disrupt them. So all the lesbian NGO parallel event meetings, we all went underground. So it was all by word of mouth or sort of telephone or wrote guest ethnotries or whatever we were doing at that time. But, we didn't have so much things as, like the internet wasn't such a big thing then, even though it was starting. So it was actually quite an organisational challenge for lesbians then, because the main enemy was very clearly the right. I think the main enemy is still very clearly the right, but because I think trans ideology is fundamentally regressive ideology, but that's something we can talk about at another time. So that was sort of the experience, but we had a hell of a good time bonding with lesbians. We also in the women's NGO space, we had a chance, I forget whether it was 2000 or 2005, but Noeline Heiser, who was then director of UniFem, spoke to us quite eloquently about the fact that the women's sections of the UN had bugger all funding. Yeah. So what else is new? So when UN Women got created a few years ago, and the Vision for the Advancement of Women was one of the arms that got folded into UN Women along with UniFem. But those different women's sections of the, and UN Women is now the Secretariat for the Commission on Status of Women at the UN. But at the time, and I think still, what focuses on women in the UN has insufficient funding compared to a lot of other agencies of the UN, and that has been a perennial complaint. And UN Women was set up partly to try and address that and give women's issues higher status within the UN. Unfortunately, then we got transed, because around the time that UN Women was getting set up, we had SOGI, and the Yogyakarta Principles, which was, LGBT alphabet soup rights, which was promoted by the then Louise Arbour, I think her name was. She was from Quebec. She was then head of the Human Rights Council of the UN, and she pushed very heavily for these principles to be adopted by the Human Rights Council. And the Human Rights Council started doing research on homosexuality and gender identity, and so on and so forth. One of the problems with the Yogyakarta Principles, and one of the significant departures from the Yogyakarta Principles from the Montreal Declaration, I was at the Montreal LGBT Human Rights Conference, which was a great conference in many respects, and there was a declaration that came out of that conference, read out by Martina Navratilova, and it specifically mentioned violence against women. When the Yogyakarta Principles were developed, that reference disappeared. So anything that was woman-specific completely disappeared from the declaration. So we have now this sort of LGBT alphabet soup stuff competing with women's rights and with lesbian rights, and lesbians are just the first letter of an alphabet, and that's very tokenistic because it's not really about lesbian rights at all. So since that has developed within the UN framework and supported by most Western states, most Latin American states, and a few others, it's been quite uphill battle for us as lesbians to have any sort of feminist voice within the UN space. And I haven't been involved in that area for a long time, but I know that Cole auspiced Women's Declaration International Forum at the NGO conference last year, or this, I forget which, I think it was last year. And unfortunately, the timing was not very friendly for us in Australia, so I don't think I made any of them because they were all in the middle of the night. But because WDI doesn't currently have ECOSOC status, I think they're planning to apply for it in their own right. We'll see how that goes, given the brief that WDI has and given the pushback against sex-based rights. Fortunately, we still do have CEDAW, which does actually talk about sex-based rights. Hopefully that is not going to get changed. And if it does get changed, well, it has to be a whole new treaty. And that's a little bit more complicated than reforming the Sex Discrimination Act to add gender identity in Australia, which sort of passed through with barely a whisper and no consultation. But in the UN, they actually have to get a treaty, which means they have to get the member states to sign on to it. And I think they'll have trouble with that one. So hopefully we've still got CEDAW. Couple of other things very briefly before I hand over to, I think it's Vivian next. COAL has had, in the almost 30 years since its founding, it's had some sort of lulls and periods of activity, and the current committee came in after a bit of a lull. And we've been working hard to re-galvanise COAL. Unfortunately, that work has happened at the same time as there is increasing institutionalisation of transgender ideology. and erosion of women's sex-based rights. So a lot of COAL energy has been taken up writing submissions to various state governments about their so-called gay conversion therapy bans, which are really a smoke screen for imposing transgender ideology in Australia, and various other laws that are coming in. We've also been involved. There was a survey run about what lesbians want. I wasn't very involved with that. Viviane might be able to talk more about that than I can, because I wasn't very involved with that particular activity. I've just been centrally involved in writing a chapter that COAL has submitted or is about to submit to the WDI book that is going to come out next year. So that's very exciting. And we've set up a website, which Viviane will talk about. And just before I hand over, somebody in the chat mentioned something about ageing, and I can't remember in reference to what. But as COAL ages, our membership is also ageing. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, because associations come and go, and there is renewal through other things. However, I'm really personally concerned that we have some intergenerational connection within COAL, because we are the only lesbian organisation in Australia that is specifically focused on lesbian rights as sex-based rights. And we really need that defence of lesbian sex-based rights to be happening intergenerationally, because I know there are younger women who are concerned about this. But it is also it is a problem with every feminist organisation, that intergenerational renewal, and I think it is a challenge that's facing COAL right now. That's a personal reflection. Others may not agree. That's all for me. Thanks. ACON is the AIDS Council of New South Wales, which was, as the name suggests, set up in the period of the AIDS epidemic to specifically campaign around that. It has since expanded its reach. It's become more national than its reach, although its main funder remains the New South Wales government. But it has copied Stonewall's Workplace Equality Index. It's copied Stonewall's lexicon of vocabulary. The Australian Broadcasting Commission has a gold tick. Special Broadcasting Service, which is our multicultural station, apparently also has a gold tick, if I remember correctly. And so it's really like the misnomer human rights organisation, or Human Rights Council, Human Rights something or other in the United States, which is a similar organisation which does the rainbow ticking stuff as well. So their influence is really quite significant. And research, a recent research paper they put out, and we're currently looking at in Australian Feminists for Women's Rights, paper they recently put out says that, X% of trans suffer, Y% of violence and so on. We think those stats are a bit dodgy, because a lot of the papers we've looked at that cite these sorts of stats about the most vulnerable group are extremely dodgy. So we're looking into that. However, Australian media and state leaders are now citing that research as gospel truth. The preponderant influence of ACON, which is sort of like Stonewall down under, right, is appalling. As concerns lesbians in particular, for Lesbian Visibility Day this year, ACON featured a trans-identified male. That person was featured as the poster person for Lesbian Visibility Day. They had a man on their poster. That person was also featured in an Australian Broadcasting Commission very popular series called You Can't Ask That, where people are asked difficult questions about somewhat taboo subjects. And in the episode on lesbians, that person was also featured. So this sort of thing is the Australian Workplace Equality Index, the subservience of our media and our institutions to this ACON mantra, and to the fact that lesbians no longer exist for them. They're men. I'm involved in a new group called Australian Feminists for Women's Rights, set up with the explicit aim of lobbying the new federal government, because we think this is a political opportunity and we wish to lobby the government coming explicitly from the political left about the impact of gender identity ideology. I've been currently working very hard on a document that presents some common assertions about trans rights and checks the facts. We're a small group, we're remaining small to keep focused, because we don't want to have endless conversations about process or strategy. We want to actually focus and get things done. So we have, not everyone who is a member of that group can be public as a member of that group because of risks to her in her workplace or in her political associations. So only a few of us, including myself, are prepared to stick our necks out and be public. Unfortunately, we are. But it is a real serious problem that women are suffering serious repercussions in their workplaces and in their political organisations or other organisations of which they're part, as we know. But because of what happened with the recent Australian federal election, those of you logging in from overseas may have heard about it, but a political candidate, much favoured by the hard right of the Liberal Party, including the former Prime Minister, stood explicitly on a gender identity, a platform questioning gender identity. And there was much division in the feminist community about the logic of that choice. And I'm not going to rehearse those conversations now because I know there's disagreement. But it sort of turned the issue into a bit of a political football. The Greens dug in saying transgender rights are non-negotiable, blah. The right said, we have to question gender identity. And Labor, which won the election, sort of dodged the question. And whenever the current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, did answer a question, it went sort of in our direction. So that was somewhat encouraging. So there's a political opportunity to try and get some stuff done and get some things questioned. The Cass review and the recent decision of the NHS with the Tavistock Clinic, Alison Bailey's win, and some other developments are really very encouraging for us. Bill Shorten's decision on the terminology of mother, it's a small thing, but it's also a big thing in terms of pushing back against this ideology, and Shorten's right in that we need language that is intelligible to minority communities, to people who don't know necessarily what a cervix is, and so on, even native English speakers, and so on, that we're actually excluding a whole bunch of women when we use this terminology that is not intelligible to them. So those are the sorts of things I'm working on, and a whole bunch of other things to do with gender ideology. But we wish to do it from the left, because what's happened in Australia is that the issue has become framed as a left-right division in the wider political sphere, where a whole bunch of people in Australia don't really know what's going on, and if pressed on the question would probably say this is crazy, but they don't really get a voice. So we want to actually, so I'm sort of, my energy's a little bit taken up with that because I'm getting frustrated. I'm getting frustrated about having debates about, whether supporting this candidate or that candidate is a good thing, having debates about, or just having rants about things without really developing a strategy. I want us to have a strategy. I'm not saying that Cole doesn't have a strategy, because Cole has done fabulous work, and particularly big thanks to Helen Daintree, who was on the committee, is no longer on the committee. She's taking a bit of a rest, but Helen did some colossal work on the submission to the Queensland government, and I think that work needs to be recognised. And other people also were involved in preparing submissions to various governments in Cole. So Cole's been, our lesbian workers sort of got hijacked by this issue, as you've all heard, and as other speakers have pinpointed. And that's frustrating for me as a lesbian, because I think there is a recreation of our lesbian spaces and our lesbian community and our lesbian culture as a former great generation is leaving us, as Susan very eloquently pointed out. We need that space. We need a space where younger lesbians can go, because at the moment we're driven underground, and all younger lesbians have is this sort of, alphabet soup bullshit. The only role models they have are, if you're butch, you're trans. That's sort of, to simplify it a little bit, but not by very much. So lesbians aren't getting that connection with feminist voices because we're being shut out. So it really is urgent for us as lesbians and as women that something shifts in the Australian polity. And I'm getting very impatient for that to happen, which is why I'm involved in this other group. I'm also doing stuff with Cole. I was, one of the main contributors to this chapter for the WDI book, along with Barbary.